So,
or is that just at the end of this whole
synapses.
thing? Yeah.
A synapse is a junction between two neurons or a nerve cell and a muscle cell. Okay? It's a junction between two nerve cells or a nerve cell and a muscle cell. Let's take a look at the anatomy of a synapse. You did this in anatomy, but it's good to review. If we look at those synaptic knobs that were at the ends of the telodendria, we find that the synaptic knobs don't actually touch the postsynaptic membrane. Right? They don't actually touch that next cell. There is a space between them called the synaptic cleft. Okay? This is the synaptic cleft. Inside the synaptic knob, we find lots and lots of synaptic vesicles, and those vesicles contain neurotransmitters. Okay? So in the synaptic knob, lots of vesicles with neurotransmitters. Because this process requires lots of energy, not surprisingly, we find lots of mitochondria. Makes sense, right? Lots and lots of mitochondria in here. On the postsynaptic membrane, there are going to be receptors for the neurotransmitters that are released from the synaptic knob. Okay? So we're going to have receptors on that postsynaptic membrane. If we look at how a synapse functions, how this works, we find that an electrical impulse comes down the presynaptic neuron, but the impulse can't cross to the next neuron because of that cleft. The space means it can't cross. So as that impulse comes into that presynaptic membrane area, that synaptic knob, it turns out that that action potential is going to open up some gates for calcium. Okay? So some channels that we haven't talked about, there are calcium channels that are gated, voltage regulated. That impulse will cause the calcium channels to open. This diagram is trying to show that. Calcium is predominantly on the outside of the cell, right? Extracellular fluid. It will diffuse to the inside. Okay? So that impulse allows calcium to move to the inside. When calcium moves to the inside, there are a number of steps that occur. Turns out that when that calcium comes in, it's going to activate an enzyme that we call a protein kinase. Okay? It's going to activate a protein kinase. That protein kinase, when it's active, is going to allow these vesicles to move to the membrane, the surface membrane here of the synapse, and rupture. There's an intermediate in here that I don't really care that you know at this point. It's called Calmodulin. We'll get to that a little bit later when we get to the endocrine system. But so the calcium is going to activate this Calmodulin, which actually does the activation of the protein kinase. For now, I'd just like you to know, calcium comes in, it activates a protein kinase, and when that protein kinase becomes active, it allows the synaptic vesicles with their transmitters to move to the surface of that presynaptic membrane, rupture, and release their transmitters. The transmitters are going to diffuse across and bind to receptors, and when it binds to receptors, it's going to cause something to happen on the postsynaptic membrane. And this diagram is trying to show you what can happen here. So when the neurotransmitter binds to the postsynaptic membrane receptors, very commonly, when the transmitter binds, here they're saying acetylcholine. You learned about acetylcholine in anatomy, right? Common. It was the first neurotransmitter ever discovered, right? So in this case, they're showing when acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter, binds to these receptors. In this case, the receptor is also the sodium channel. Okay? It's also the sodium channel, and it's going to allow sodium to move to the inside. So the binding of the transmitter to the receptor opens the channel. There's another way that receptors in that postsynaptic membrane can work. It turns out that sometimes the receptor is not the channel. So the neurotransmitter binds to the receptor. Here they're showing it binds to the receptor. When it binds to that receptor, it causes the release of some special proteins that we call the G proteins. And the G proteins will move through the membrane and open a channel. And so this is kind of an indirect way that the neurotransmitter can work. Right? So two different ways. Sometimes the neurotransmitter binds directly to the receptor, which is on the channel, and opens the channel. Sometimes the neurotransmitter binds to a receptor that has to release G proteins, which will move to other areas in the membrane and open the channel.